Welcome everybody to this COVID economics seminar. So this is a seminar jointly organized by CEPR and the Graduate Institute Geneva, and is a seminar series which showcases some of the papers collected in the COVID economics veteran and real-time papers, which is an initiative by CEPR, which is coordinated by my colleague Charles Wipros and many others. So today we are super happy to have Luis Cabral, who is a professor at NYU Stern, and he will present a paper which is joined with Lei Xu on a topic which has been at the center of the discussion in many countries, and is the topic of price gouging. And so there was this idea, you know, should retailers increase the price of hand sanitizer or mask or whatever? What's the optimal thing to do? So the paper is Seller Reputation and Price Gouging, Evidence from COVID-19 Pandemic. Luis will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A. You can ask your question using the chat, or you can raise your hand if you know, and then we can give you the microphone. If you have some very pressing question that you would like to ask immediately, some clarification question, please raise your hand and we'll give you the microphone. But that's it from me. That's so, Luis.
Thank you, Ugo. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to share some of my recent research with Lei Xu on seller reputation and price gouging. Now, this presentation is largely based on a research paper we wrote recently, which was one of the early CEPR COVID papers. But I'm going to go a little beyond that and talk a little bit about the sort of big picture of you know, efficiency versus equity when it comes to issues of price gouging. And also, after talking about some of the empirical results, a little bit about policy implications and maybe even possibly recommendations that we might have based on this. I should also add the obvious disclaimer that the opinions here presented do not necessarily represent those of the institutions we work for, and in fact, not necessarily those of my co-author, because I'm going to go a little bit beyond, strictly speaking, the content of the paper and talk a little more about the big issues of markets and efficiency and so forth. But the research team in here is myself. I'm at NYU Stern, and Lei Xu is a senior economist at the Bank of Canada. So what I want to do is go through a fairly lengthy introduction, just motivating the issues, efficiency versus fairness, and how economists think about that. Because I think this is one of the topics where there's a big gap between the way your average economist thinks and the way your average citizen thinks. And so I think it's useful to talk a little bit about that. And then I'll spend relatively little time talking about the empirical model and the data we use and the results we get to. In fact, more than talk about econometric results, I think the bulk of our evidence is just look at the data, just time series, and let the data talk. Once you see that, you'll realize that our econometric specification is almost like an afterthought with respect to what you see in the data. But I'll talk a little about that as well. And finally, talk a little bit about policy recommendations, policy implications from our results, and just try to bring back some of the issues that are kind of recurrent whenever we have a crisis like the crisis we had this year. And all of that hopefully in less than 40 minutes. So price gouging, as I just mentioned earlier, there's probably not one topic that creates so much contrast, as I would say, between the way economists typically think and the way other people think. However, as I will try to argue next, I think there's a sense in which economists have evolved a little bit in the way they think about this. And what I'd like to bring in here, it's not in the paper, this is something that I've brought in here. I decided to go back to the ING forum, which is a forum that's been created by Chicago Booth. It's basically a panel. I think we have a number of those in Europe as well. You may be familiar with some of the ones in Europe as well. So Chicago Booth has put together this panel of economists. It's mostly from leading US schools. And regularly they will ask them questions. They ask them to say, do you agree or do you not agree with this statement, in all these gradations from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and also asking them for specific comments. And the thing I would like to show you in here, which to me is relatively impressive, is the extraordinary contrast between the 2012 question and the 2020 question. Now, two important caveats I should give you before continuing. First, this is not a balanced panel. There have been many economists that have joined in 2020 who were not present in 2012, and vice versa. So, you know, that's one big grain of salt in here. The second one, the questions are not the same, I have to admit, but they are similar. So in 2012, Connecticut was proposing a bill, Senate Bill number 60, banning price gouging, banning unconsciously excessive prices, whatever that is. And in 2020, the question that was put to the panel was, laws to prevent high prices for essential goods in short supply in a crisis would raise social welfare. So they're not the same question, but they're all around the same idea, that laws that prevent or that ban price gouging, okay? You would agree that at least they go in the same direction. And now you look at the numbers, and it's quite remarkable that it's almost the opposite. You know, in 2012, you have 53 plus 24, so a good 3/4 of the respondents saying that either they disagree or they strongly disagree with anti-price gouging laws. And in 2020, again, you have like the opposite. 3/4 of the inquiries either strongly agree or agree with laws that go against price gouging. I find this really remarkable. And so what I did, and I don't know if this is representative of the economics profession or not, probably not. I mean, this is a small sample, just a couple dozen economists, but nevertheless, I thought this would be an interesting way to start our discussion of price gouging. And then what I did also, I went into the actual comments, and first thing you have, of course, you have the economists who represent what I call the conventional economic wisdom, which is, let the markets work. Laws against price gouging are bad because they a lot of efficiency loss. I could fill several slides with quotes. And so this is just a few that came to me. Carolyn Hawksby, for example, I sympathize with the intention, but goods must be allocated in some way, and prices are better than first come or fights breaking out among people. In other words, I mean, okay, markets are not perfect, but the alternative is a lot worse. It's people fighting for things. It's long lines, long queues. Some are lucky to get there early. I don't know, whatever. And we have here many, Judy Chevalier, we need to stimulate supply. That's the other thing that economists will always refer. Robert Scheimer, we will be encouraging hoarding in black markets. So this is something that we're used to. This is something we studied when we're taking Economics 101. Maybe this is something we teach in today's markets. And this is, I would say, the conventional wisdom amongst economists. But then I also found a minority of economists, and Sir Angus Deaton might have been probably the only one who actually wrote in both 2012 and 2020 that I agree with the anti-price gouging laws because efficiency in these situations is relatively secondary. This, I would say, it's still a minority kind of opinion among economists, but I believe it's a growing one. And Deaton is probably the only one who, throughout this period, maintained that same opinion. We do see a fair amount of evolution. And here I'm showing you two economists, Ken Judd from Stanford and Darrell Duffy, also from Stanford, in fact. And for example, here you have Darrell Duffy in 2012, efficiency allocation by market prices is good, as long as you don't have monopoly effects, but prices are good. But then in 2020, it still says that market pricing may be neoclassically efficient. And I put efficient in quotation marks. I'm not sure why. But rationing could help many poor and vulnerable people. So we see an evolution in here of the way people think. Again, this is not representative. I'm not making any claim, but I thought this is sort of an interesting cross-section of the economics profession. And finally, there is one of the panel members I would like to highlight because it is very closely related to what I'll be talking about. And that's Richard Thaler, the economics laureate 2 years ago. Both in 2012 and 2020, he more or less says the same. We don't need laws. This is kind of the third way, because he's not saying I'm against the laws because efficiency and market clearing prices are much better. No, he doesn't say that. He just says that, you know, it will be okay. Why? Because you have large firms and they will hold their prices firm. They're not going to price gouge. You're always going to have large firms that you can trust. Or to put it differently, the public usually enforces the laws of fairness without legal action. What are you talking about? That's what this paper is all about. To what extent can seller reputation and the public's enforcement of that reputation substitute for law or the market in attaining the right balance between efficiency and fairness? This is by no means a novel idea. And at least this goes back to Akerlof, 1980. Perhaps you could go back and also talk about the work of Klein and Crawford and many other economists before them. But I would say that Akerlof is probably the first person who formalizes this idea. Now, he's not so much interested in price gouging. He's interested in fair wage. But if you think about it, it's a similar problem. If you have laws of a minimum wage or a fair wage, that often results in unemployment. This is what he was interested in. And this is something that for a neoclassical economist is hard to understand. Why would you have that? I mean, there are people who are unemployed who would be willing to work for a lower wage, and still firms are not offering that lower wage. Why? Well, it's a custom. It's what you would refer to as out of equilibrium customs in the economy. People just know that it's not fair to pay a very low wage, even if there's a glut of a labor supply. And how does that happen? Well, it's a very simple idea. It's a reputational game that's being played. In the lingo of game theory, it's a repeated game or relational contract between a firm and employees in this case. And yes, the firm could short run deviate and set a lower wage, but then it would be boycotted by employees. Maybe they would work not as hard, or maybe they would not go and work for that firm. I don't know. There's a variety of mechanisms, and we know from repeated game theory that there are equilibria that will balance these short-term gains with the long-term costs of doing so. And even though we're not talking about wages and employment in here, there is an analogous application of the Akerlof principle to price gouging. We may have reputation concerned sellers who could, if they wanted to, they could increase prices, but they're not going to do so because they're afraid of what this will do to their reputation, that they will be boycotted by buyers, who will not buy from them in the future, and so forth. This is what Richard Thaler has in mind in those two answers I showed you before. And in fact, he did some research on that, precisely on that, on price gouging, taking the, or bringing the Akerlof theory to the data together with Daniel Kahneman and a third co-author, I cannot remember off the top of my head right now. So this is what we're going to try to do here today. We're going to test Akerlof's theory, C.L. Kahneman et al., not et al., who also did some work on price gouging. And the idea is that during periods of excess demand, sellers with a reputation at stake, and I'll try to be clear what I mean by that, are less likely to increase prices. And that therefore the market mechanism itself is already doing a lot to protect buyers from price gouging. We're going to look at that in the context of a COVID-19 pandemic using data for 3M face masks and Purell hand sanitizer sold on Amazon. And we are indeed going to confirm that new sellers, in other words, what we consider sellers who have less of a reputation at stake, are much more likely to increase prices. In fact, they set prices that are twice as high as other existing continuing sellers. And also sellers with longer histories, and in terms of longer consumer feedback histories, are also going to be less likely to increase prices. So we will find strong evidence for the Akerlof / Thaler et al. Kind of argument that the market is already doing a lot to protect consumers from price gouging through reputations. Now, whether this is enough or not, this is something I will like to come back to later in the paper when we talk about policy implications. We get similar qualitative results using multiple measures of reputation and multiple measures of scarcity. So I think this is going to be a very simple paper, just has this one result. But then the paper itself, which I'm not going to go through in great detail, just goes through a variety of ways of measuring these effects and convincing the reader that this is a fairly robust empirical result. So very briefly, now moving on to model and data, chronology. COVID was first found in China. The first US case, I'm going to be looking at US data, is January 15th of this year. By March 26th, US already had the highest number of confirmed cases in the world. And on March 23rd, another important milestone in here, under a lot of media pressure, Amazon released a statement against price gouging. They remove about 500,000 offers, and they also suspend quite a large number of sellers suspected of price gouging. And on March 25th, this event on March 25th is very closely related to this one on March 23rd. We believe Amazon's decision was sort of already having in mind the letter that was sent to them by 34 attorneys general. Letters that were sent to all of the major platforms advising them to act on price gougers. And we think that this was sort of almost like a preventative action by Amazon in that regard. So these are some of the events that are going to be relevant for us in here today. So let me go straight, talk about empirically what we're going to look at, what kind of model. We're going to have a model that relates price ratio by seller I for product J at time T to a variety of factors. First, let me define what I mean by price ratio. This is the ratio of the price set in 2020 with respect to the average price sold by Amazon during 2019. So it gives you an idea how much higher prices right now compared to last year. Inflation is very small. In fact, it's orders of magnitude smaller than what I have in here. So forget about inflation for that purpose. This is a good measure of how much higher prices are now than they were last year. And so I is seller, J is the item, T is the day. And then we're going to have, for our first model, model number one, a bunch of dummies. Amazon, an incumbent seller. Incumbent seller is a seller that was already selling on Amazon before COVID. An entrant seller is someone who only starts selling when COVID is in place. Okay, this is a very important distinction for our theory. And the theory is that the coefficient on an entrant is going to be higher than the coefficient on an incumbent. In other words, that if you're an incumbent, you have more of a reputation at stake, you're playing a kind of longer term game with buyers, you're less likely to increase prices. This is the Akerlof idea. This is the Kahneman, Thaler et al. Kind of idea. This is one way of measuring how much the seller has at stake, incumbents versus entrants. Another one, this is our second model, is just look at their history as measured by their reputation score. How many reputation reviews, how many reviews have they had in the past? In prior research, including research that I've done with Alior Tashsu on eBay, we know that the number of reviews is actually a very good proxy for how big and how old you are as a seller, because there's a very stable percentage of sales. I mean, the ratio of sales to reviews is very stable. So the number of reviews is actually a very good indicator of size and length. And in here, the theory would predict that the coefficient that relates the number of reviews and measure scarcity would be negative. In fact, in both models, I forgot to mention that S is a measure of scarcity, because I would expect that these effects, the difference between incumbents and entrants, would become important, especially when there is scarcity, when there is a crisis in place. So you can think of this as sort of like a diff kind of analysis, okay? So the data we use, we're looking at a sample of March 1st to March 15th. We're looking at sales on Amazon of 14 different 3M face mask items and 17 different Purell hand sanitizers.
Luis, can I interrupt you 1 second?
Yes.
There is a clarification question from Yossi Spiegel, who is
Yes.
asking, what's the control group? It says you have I and E dummies. What are the observations we do not belong to either E or I?
It's Amazon.
It's Amazon, okay. Okay, thanks.
Okay. So Amazon sells these items. And as you know, Amazon both sells their own items. They service the sales of other parties, and they also work as a third party, just a platform. There's these 3 different ways in which Amazon works. And we're here using Amazon as a seller of these items. And these are all items that Amazon sells. That's one of the criteria for selection.
So Yossi is saying that you also have an Amazon dummy, but you don't estimate it, I assume.
Yeah, but the dummies are interacted with the scarcity measure. So we use all 3 dummies. There's no issue of collinearity in here.
Good.
So in terms of price features and seller characteristics, we got Keepa Data. It's a well-known data provider for that tracks data on Amazon. And we use 3 different measures of scarcity. Amazon is outstocked is one measure. It's usually the first thing that happens when things get really bad. Is Amazon eventually gets out of stock, because Amazon, as we'll see, does not increase prices. They do not price gouge. S2 is going to be the percentage of incumbent sellers who are out of stock. So these are the continuing sellers, precisely because they're reluctant to increase prices. As we'll see, they also get outstocked. And the third one, which we tried, turns out not to be a great, but it's an interesting measure of scarcity, is cumulative intensity of Google searches for certain keywords like masks, hand sanitizers, and so forth. It kind of makes sense. We are in a crisis. People are going to be more searches for those items. Okay. These measures of scarcity, which we're using, as you can see, the first 2 are incredibly high. The correlation is very high. So it kind of shows us that these are probably pretty good measures of scarcity. The Google searches does not correlate as cleanly, but they're also positively correlated. And this is for 3M masks. This is for Purell sanitizer. In here, the correlation is not as high, but it's still fairly high correlation between these measures. Okay. So as I mentioned to you earlier, because I do not have a lot of time, and B, because I think the data speaks volumes in here, I'm going to spend more time primarily showing you data rather than regressions. But before that, some summary statistics. I don't think I have a lot to say in here other than just notice the variable price ratio. This is the ratio of 2020 prices with respect to 2019 prices. Some cases, they're actually pricing lower than last year in some days for some products by some sellers. But look at this, 40 times higher than last year. This is what people refer as price gouging. I would pay more attention to this than to the prices in here, because these are absolute prices, and some of the items are actually packages with several Purells, and so it's kind of very difficult to actually measure that. I think the price ratio is a much better indicator. So 43 times higher than the price of just a few months earlier. This is what we're talking about. In terms of sellers, we have a lot of newcomer sellers with 0 reviews. We have sellers with almost 1 million reviews. So there's quite a variety of sellers in terms of size. We also use log for that purpose, because logs usually is a better measure for a purpose of regression. Our measures of scarcity are all normalized to 0, 1. This is a normalization. And so we already showed you that before. Now, I'm not going to go through in great detail the econometrics, but one of the issues that we have is, of course, we have to use instruments. This is a part that our work is still kind of work in progress because, you know, there are issues with IVs in here, but we're currently using a number of cases, number of deaths in both China, US, and rest of the world. The problem with this is if instruments, of course, that are both correlated with supply and with demand. So there are issues. We are actually open to suggestions on this more technical side of how to deal with that. I'll talk a little more about that in a few minutes. So as I mentioned earlier, I just want to look at the data. I think that a lot can be gotten just by looking at the data. So look at this. This is time in here from January 1st to April 1st. And what we have in here is the price set by Amazon. By the way, this is the price ratio, is with respect to the previous year, because we have items which would not be comparable directly otherwise. This is the price set by continuing sellers. So sellers who already existed before COVID, which is in here. This is before COVID hits the US. And these are the newcomer sellers. So this pretty much says that Akerlof was kind of essentially, Akerlof / Kahneman / Thaler were essentially right. For Amazon, I'm actually plotting this as a scatter so as to see when Amazon is outstocked. So I only plot prices in this graph when there are items on sale. If there's no items on sale, I'm not plotting the price at all. So Amazon starts getting outstocked in here, and then it's completely outstocked. Occasionally there are 2 days when it still has it, but not at all. The continuing sellers, they do increase prices a little bit, but considerably less than the newcomer sellers, and they are outstocked by March. And then the newcomers, they set considerably higher prices. They survive, quote unquote, they're stocked until a little later, but eventually they stop, not so much because they're outstocked as because I think they are banned from Amazon. So if there's a picture you want to keep, this is the picture you want to keep in your mind. And everything, all the discussion regarding efficiency and equity and about the effect of seller reputation is going to be encapsulated to a great extent in this picture. So I'll pause for another 2 seconds just to emphasize that I think this says a lot. Now we do this for Purell, we get something similar. In fact, in here, the gap is probably even bigger, if anything. It's quite remarkable. Even though we do have here a period where we have entering sellers actually selling at a low price, which, by the way, everything, the data is imperfect. I mean, entrant sellers does not mean that they are new sellers. There could be sellers that were selling some of the product. This could be very large sellers. They're new for this product. So this is the reason why we're going to look at other measures of reputation, not just this one. But by and large, we see a similar pattern that we saw for 3M masks. Okay. And then the other reputation measure we have, instead of looking at entrants and incumbents, forget about entrants and incumbents, let's just measure their reputation count. And so I'm going to split the sample into more than 1,000 reviews. These are the big sellers, the ones who have more of a reputation at stake, and the small sellers, the ones who have less of a reputation at stake. And again, huge gap. As you can see, before COVID, the differences are very small. In fact, I'm not even clear, it's not even clear which way this would go, because you might have thought that a seller with a bigger reputation might be able to sell at a higher price, maybe, but what happens is that the difference is very small. But their colors are going to show when the crisis hits. And the smaller sellers clearly set higher prices than the larger sellers. Again, very similar to what I showed before for entrants and incumbents. None of the measures is perfect in terms of capturing what is a seller with a reputation at stake, but I think it does a decent job at that. And for Purell, it doesn't seem like it's the same thing, but this is actually a big difference in here. Maybe it's not obvious, but you also get that. So, you know, We then bring it to the data with a formal model, with a series of formal models with item and seller fixed effects. And so here the key is that the coefficients on the interaction of scarcity incumbent and scarcity and entrant ought to be higher for entrant, and it is systematically higher, as you can see, and statistically significant. So we do identify that difference. I mean, there are a number of caveats in here, and this is also a call for suggestions from the great econometricians of the world. And I hope that some of you are listening to me right now. And it's a call for help with that. So the instruments are not great, I have to admit. They're correlated both with supply and demand. Which means that the model estimates may be biased. But I do notice, however, it's kind of interesting that the difference between OLS and IV in terms of coefficient estimates is actually relatively small. I don't know if that's reassuring or not, but that's something we're getting. In other words, it is a caveat in here. And the second one, a very important caveat, I have no data on costs. So I'm making no statements regarding margins. I'm making a statement about prices. But that said, you know, gouging is more about prices than margins. So there's a sense in which looking at prices may not be a bad thing, maybe in fact, maybe the right thing to do. But nevertheless, these are two caveats with the econometric results. And so this brings me to the last point of my presentation. I was shooting for 8:40, and so I think I'm doing fine. And so this is the only slide I have, but I'm going to take my time in here. What does this all mean in practice? Because, you know, this is the Center for Economic Policy Research. And so what does this all mean for policy? I think the point we're trying to make, in fact, as a theory point, it has been made by Akerlof and by Kahneman and Tal and many others, is that the price system is more than just supply and demand. We economists think about the price system, Econ 101, supply equals demand, and it's the law of supply and demand, and price tends to converge to that. That's efficient, that brings the good to those who are willing to pay the most. You know, we know that. That's the Kool-Aid we've all drank growing up. And so we are familiar with that. But the point that people like George Akerlof and others who've studied the role of institutions in the economy have been trying to bring forth in several ways, including in this context, is that, well, in the economy, there's more than just the law of supply and demand. There are other things going on. And one that seems particularly important is the idea of seller reputation, and the idea of thinking of seller reputation as a relational contract between buyers and sellers. This is something that a number of applied game theorists, including myself, have done research on, that these relational contracts do play an important role in terms of provision of quality. That's usually how we think of those contracts. What holds sellers from cheating buyers, but also it plays an important role in price setting. Okay, and so here's now the idea. This is a little bit outside of the, I'm now going to be outside of the paper and thinking a little bit outside of the box. What is a fair price? Well, one candidate for a fair price, I would propose, I would submit, is precisely the price that's quote unquote agreed upon between buyers and sellers, in particular between buyers and long-run sellers. In other words, those sellers who have a reputation at stake and who are potentially or can potentially be victims or can be punished by buyers if they fail to set fair prices. And so the idea is that, as Richard Thaler would say, perhaps we do not need a law, an anti-price gouging law. Perhaps what we need is to have long-term sellers and to let the reputational contract, let consumers decide what's fair. If consumers decide that something's unfair, they will boycott that seller. Now, this does take care of your Amazons of this world. If Amazon tries to price gouge, they'll suffer. So we don't need a law. let the market, and in particular, let the market for seller reputations take care of that. That still does not solve the problem of small sellers, of unconscionable sellers who just come in to make a profit when there's a supply a shock or a demand shock. And so a possible compromise, and this will be sort of the main point I'm going to throw in here as a possibility, a possible compromise for an anti-gouging statute is that entering sellers, and these are the sellers who do not have a reputation at stake. I could have a different measure of low reputation sellers, but let's assume entering sellers during a period of crisis cannot set a higher price than continuing sellers. I mean, of course, we could refine this. We could say they cannot sell more than 10% more or more than 20% more. But my point is to try and use continuing sellers as a reference point for what's a fair price. Now, the devil's in the details. How are you actually going to implement that? I get that. I get that. But as a general principle, I would like to propose this as a compromise between an anti-price gouging law, which, by the way, they're usually very vague. You cannot set unconsciously high prices. What on earth do you mean by unconsciously high prices? So it'll be a compromise between these anti-price gouging laws, which are what's in place right now. So that's what we have right now. And the opposite extreme, which is the laissez-faire economics thing that let the prices go up because that's good. That's good for the economy. That's good for supply. That's good for everyone, which a lot of people disagree. I would say 99% of the population disagrees. And in my opinion, probably with a good reason. So I would like to propose this as a compromise. And with that, I will finish just a few minutes before time. But I'd rather take those minutes just to see if there's any feedback to this idea or anything else in the paper before that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm unmuting myself. So good, thanks a lot, Luis. So we have two questions. One, I mean, I don't know if the answer is easy. The question is easy. It's when you show the graph by comparing, you know, Amazon new seller and old seller. One question is why was the price of the you know, non-Amazon seller already higher than Amazon before the crisis?
So that's a good question. We don't address that in here. Part of that could be differences in cost. So we don't have measures of cost. That is a limitation. And it could well be the case that Amazon has a lower cost than other sellers. And what I mean by cost, I don't just mean the you know, wholesale cost. This includes the opportunity cost of making that sale, which for Amazon could be cross-subsidization, getting people to buy this product and also buy other product. So, I mean, they're complicated calculations in here, and I don't think there's any hope we're going to be able to find data on cost. So, unless you have a good suggestion how to do it, finding a good proxy. But
I don't have a good suggestion how to address this, but my intuition was that talking with some people who have been selling on Amazon, that the Amazon price is close to the minimum. Maybe it's not the lowest possible price, but it's pretty close to that. And the other guys who are selling the same product are a distribution of people. So when you compute an average, it's also automatic, almost automatic that the average is going to be, I mean, because the space to go below Amazon is much smaller than the space to go above. Probably that's why.
I do notice that,
my guess.
Yas is asking the question, why would anyone buy it from a high pricing company if they can buy a low price on Amazon? That is an interesting research question, by the way. And that doesn't apply just to this, applies to a lot of other products that are really homogeneous. There are many cases where Amazon is selling literally the same product as other products. I think there's some, there may be search frictions. there are, by the way, there are people who don't like to buy from Amazon as a matter of principle. I don't know. I don't have a very good answer. I think it's a combination of various factors, but that's not an exclusive problem of price gouging. That's a problem of day to day when Amazon sells the same item at a lower price.
So there is also why. So since you have it on the screen, there is also another question by Yossi about between the distinction between prices and margins. Why is that relevant? You see the question? You want me to read it for you?
Yeah, I have it in front of me.
So just to summarize, so the question, so why do we care about price and margins? So, you know, the only thing that matters is margin.
Well,
that's my reading of the question. I don't know if that's your reading as well.
Yeah, so I agree. If we were trying to punish profiteering, well, profiteering is about margin. It's not about setting high prices. I think a lot of this is just a matter of practicality. We're not able to measure costs, and therefore price is the closest thing we have to margin as a proxy for margin. I don't have a better answer to that. I mean, the same thing applies to excessively high prices, for which there are laws in Europe and Israel, I know, not in the US. The same thing applies to monopoly power. You know, yeah, I mean, strictly speaking, we would be interested in margin, but frequently we actually use prices as a measure of monopoly power. I don't have a very good answer to that. I think I agree with you that margin would be correct. And Yossi says there's a literature on excessive pricing, which is illegal in the EU and many other countries, I believe Israel as well. And in fact, it's more or less what I refer to. Why is there such a law? I mean, there should be a law on excessive margins, not on excessive prices. But if we have a law on excessive prices, probably it's because it's much easier to measure price than it is to measure margin. It's a compromise. By the way, dumping is a similar thing. You know, in principle, predatory pricing and dumping is about selling below cost. But frequently we use domestic price as a reference, or you know, we just, you know, we do whatever we can. We use whatever data we can.
So there is a question by Charles, which is related to something I want to ask you. So Charles is asking, what is new entrants?
So that's a good question. It's a mixed bag. So new entrants includes entrants who have not sold on Amazon before. So they are completely new to us. We didn't know that they existed. My impression is that they are entrepreneurs or speculators, depending on how we like to see them. And then there are also large sellers who were already on Amazon, but they were not selling masks or hand sanitizer. They were selling other items. And precisely because of this potential source of confusion, we decided to use two different measures of reputation. One is being an incumbent and an entrant. That's our baseline model. But the other one is looking at cumulative prior number of reviews as a measure of how long you've been around and how big you are. And our results are actually very robust for both measures. And it's one of the reasons that gives me sort of a little of confidence in this idea of having a reputation at stake does make a difference. So there are many entrants who have a reputation at stake, and they don't increase the price as much as other entrants. So if I were to split, we do that in the paper. If we were to split the entrants in truly new entrants, not only the entrants, but they're new sellers, and entrants who already have a reputation, you do find a difference in there as well. The problem is that eventually, if you start slicing the sample in very small slices, then the precision of your estimate starts disappearing.
There is a question from Fausto Panunzi, which is, I guess, is related to the margin versus prices. So that's your final policy proposal takes into account the fact that entrants may have a higher cost.
It does not. So this is part of what I said, that you know, the devil is in the details. And so instead of having a price cap be exactly the price set by existing sellers. You may give a margin to it. But even that's going to be an imperfect policy. Our point, or my point at least, is I still think this is an improvement with respect to just a vague and uniform policy of no price gouging, as the current U.S. law in most states dictates. Yeah. So this goes back to the issue of you should be looking at margins, not prices. I know. I wish I could do that. And I just don't think it's going to be very practical. If we were trying to have something that can be used, I don't think it's going to be very practical.
There are a couple of questions. We can go back to it, but one point that I wanted to make, which I guess would be addressed by your proposal, but might be a problem for your empirical strategy, or maybe not. So assume, so if I have a physical store and I want to keep my reputation, and your story is true, I mean that, I will not increase price, or will not increase price that much. On Amazon, I could create a new account and sell the hand sanitizer with my, the brand, people know me, my regular Amazon store, and another account in which I increase the price, right? That would be a possibility.
Yeah, and in fact, there's some anecdotal evidence that it happens. And this is precisely why we believe our proposal would actually be helpful, because you would prevent sellers from doing that.
Yeah, correct.
That's very smart, but it's just not going to work with our new system.
Yeah.
If you want to increase the price, you would have to increase your own price as well with your name, because that's the reference point. So I agree with you, and I think many sellers have had that idea before, and I think that's part of the problem. That's part of the problem. They try to go around the issue of reputation precisely by creating separate identities. Mm-hmm. Charles, your question about reputation count, for the purpose of the graph, we did it 0, 1, but in the regressions, it's a continuous variable. We only did 0, 1, meaning we don't did lower than 1,000 and higher than 1,000 for the purpose of the graph. So that's a good question. It has a very quick answer. Now, Yossi, most of the literature, though, compares prices to benchmark, and prices are deemed excessive if they are much higher than the benchmark. Well, I mean, in a way, that's what, this is what we're proposing. We're proposing that the benchmark should be sellers with a reputation at stake. We're making that benchmark, we're trying to create a specific benchmark, and using the Akerlof et al. Literature that sellers with a reputation are sellers whose price is fair because it's being controlled by consumers. Let's make that the benchmark. So I'm agreeing with you that this is actually, in that sense, not very different in spirit from what policy has been regarding excessive prices.
So in your proposal, was a general proposal, or a proposal for all products, or would be for like, necessities, or?
I'd say for necessities at time of crisis.
Okay.
So this is, I mean, the way it works in the US for these laws is that the states, this is in the United States, each state declares a state of emergency and dictates what are the products that are essential in the state of emergency. And so that's the set on which this law would apply, is essential products during a time of emergency. So you need these two conditions to be met. There has to be an emergency period, and the products have to be considered essential products. So I mean, we're talking about like water during Sandy, gasoline during a Hurricane Sandy as well, or I mean, things like that, which are typically the typical cases of I mean, anytime you have, hurricane, an earthquake, whatever, there's always something going on like this. This is not something new. So this is a recurrent thing. Every few years, we have the same situation. So what we're proposing, let's create a rule so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel each time this happens. Let's prepare for the next crisis so that people know what the rules are. Now, here we are in the middle of COVID, and we have attorneys general writing a letter to Amazon. I mean, come on. this shouldn't need to happen, that the things sort of a improvised law at the time of crisis. We should have a more robust system for dealing with this.
Mariolina, I saw Charles that raised his hand. Can we give the microphone to Charles? And yeah, Charles?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have a slightly longer question and I'm lazy typing. What you showed very clearly from the Chicago booth exercise is that people worry a lot about supply. Now here we're talking about 3M and Purell, but they are not selling. We're talking about intermediaries. So it's just competition among intermediaries. And unless 3M and Purell can discriminate among the sellers, this is not going to have any supply effects. I'm surprised you didn't make that point.
Well, so that is a good point. It might have some effect in the sense that there are location issues. You know, there may be many countries that have 3M masks that can be brought into the US. So if this were a worldwide market, yes, but to the extent that it's a geographically limited market, I do think there's some element of elasticity. But I mean, now that you bring that up, it's a very important point, which, by the way, to give the panel credit, some of the panelists in the Chicago booth panel did say it's all about the supply elasticity. We have to look at the supply elasticity, which I didn't talk about that, and I should have. You're right about that. I don't know what the supply elasticity is. It's not zero. I don't think it is zero, even considering that it's 3M masks. But maybe you can make the argument that imports are very unimportant, and therefore it's very close to zero, in which case the efficiency effect is relatively small. So I take your point, and I think it's an important point in studying the relative merits of efficiency and fairness in setting the rules. You know, this debate of efficiency versus equity, you know, we could go on forever in here, and I don't think we will be able to you know, to derive an optimal policy that maximizes social welfare, this and that. We need simple rules, because these things have to be put in place rapidly when there's a crisis. You know, we cannot have, let's write a paper and try to see. We need robust sets of rules. And so I'm proposing a relatively robust set of rules, which, do I have a big theory behind it? No. The only basis for this is the belief that the relational contract between buyers and long-term sellers is an equilibrium which we may consider to be fair because it's been monitored by the buyers themselves. So if the buyers were to consider it unfair, they would have a way of punishing it. And if we believe that that mechanism works well, maybe we want to use that as a benchmark. And you know, that takes care, in a way, that takes care of all the other issues. You know, what is the supply elasticity? How much welfare is lost? You know, I don't care. Buyers consider that to be the fair price. And who am I to say that they're wrong? I know this seems a little bit too libertarian for some people's tastes, but I think it's a helpful benchmark.
So we have two questions. One is about how to measure shortage, and then one by, this is by Laszlo, and one from Elizabeth Tayosa, and which, if I understand correctly, is about quality. It's like my B entrant will try to tweak on quality to be able to avoid. So when we don't have standardized products, it might be a problem.
Yeah, so the two good questions. So Laszlo, I think, okay, legally, as I mentioned to Ugo earlier, in practice, this is determined by government authorities. You know, they decide we are in a moment of, this is a state of emergency in terms of a shortage. So it's an exogenously defined by the political powers. Now, in this paper, we created our own measures of shortage. But ultimately, I think, if you ask me in terms of my proposal, that part would continue the way it's been done right now. In other words, the government in a given country, on a given state declares, this is a big unexpected shock and we're in a state of emergency. So anti-price gouging laws are in effect. That would be my proposal. I don't think you want to have a market definition of that. Elizabeth asks a very good question. It's not a problem in this paper because these are very standardized products. Well, even in this case, by the way, there's elements of quality of service, of shipping speed and stuff like that, but I think they're not a first order. There are many other cases when they may become important. And there, I'm not sure exactly what the problem is. The problem may be that if we set limits to price, then quality may become lower, as often happens with rent controls and things like that. I think that's that is a collateral damage, as it were, of anti-price gouging effects. But generally speaking, if you believe in the power of relational contracts between sellers and buyers, if you believe in the mechanism of seller reputation, there's no reason why it shouldn't take care of quality as well. In fact, at least in the literature, the way we thought about these contracts, they were primarily addressing the issue of quality, not the issue of price. There are many instances when experience goods in particular, not to mention credence goods, but I mean, particularly, let me talk about experience goods, where it's very easy for sellers to cheat because buyers at the moment of purchase cannot ascertain what they are buying. And so the thrust of the entire literature is that, well, if you have a relational contract, if you have repetition, if you have long-term sellers, then in principle, you can fix that problem. It's the Folk theorem back over again. And so in principle, that could state. So Elizabeth, she's kind of adding to her comments that it could help raise quality. Yeah, so I think you're probably thinking about the same thing that I'm thinking, that relational contracts actually can solve not only the problem of price gouging, but also the problem of quality provision. So in a way, the reason why I consider this the third way is that this kind of goes back and to the beauty of the market, but not in the market as we learned in Econ 101, which is the law of supply and demand, but the market in the industrial organizational sense, in which, we don't have an infinite number of suppliers and infinite number of buyers, and that sellers are recognizable entities. They're large, non-atomic entities who establish a relational contract with buyers. And so in that broader context of the market, then perhaps we can go back to our Econ 101 view, but different, the market actually does a decent job. And so what we need to do with anti-price gouging laws is to focus on the part of the market that does not do a good job. And that's the part of the market where you have sellers with no reputations at stake, and for whom this quick entry, quick exit is a profitable strategy to the detriment of consumers. That's the part that we need to address, and that we should use the long-term sellers as a natural benchmark.
Thanks, Luis. So we have 2 minutes. One thing that I wanted to add while you were talking with Charles about this fact that, the supply effect could go across border, but there you could also have, externalities across country, right? You remember that at the beginning of the crisis, there were trucks with masks stopped. So if, so again, you might think that, a country that has some sort of regulation will receive negative externalities from a country that doesn't have regulation, and will respond with this inefficient way by, prohibiting exports or whatever. So that's another interesting element, no?
I think that's not only interesting, I think that's actually quite an important element. And it also say that masks are actually not a good example. I mean, it's an important example because it's what we have data for right now. but the problem with masks is that, like I said, you don't just have the externalities across countries. You have an enormous externality in the use of masks, and so they're in a way they're a public good, and it's not a public good in technical sense. But I want to encourage people to use masks in a way that's very different. I want to encourage people to buy gasoline or drinking water. So I think the mask example, there's so many, it's so loaded. There's so many layers to it of externalities and so forth that I fear it may not be the best example, but it's what we had in here. So I take that point and I accept it and I understand it. But think of, bottles of water or what have you. And also think of the fact that in many cases, this export-import is not so much across countries, it can be across cities. I mean, just to give you an example, which I think is probably better for the Economist, is Hurricane Sandy, which basically stopped the supply of gasoline to the New York area because the port became inaccessible. It's just not a problem for the United States, it was a problem for a relatively small area. And the laws of anti-price gouging were placed in effect. And in here, this is probably the best case for the classical, neoclassical economist point. If the price of gasoline remains very low, there's very little incentive for me to take a truck to Philadelphia. There's plenty of gasoline in Philadelphia, which is an hour away by truck. This is the classical example of the benefits of high prices. Just going to create a huge incentive for me to go and import. And the externality in there, it would be minimal. It's not like the people in Philadelphia are going to be without gasoline. It's just a matter of arbitraging. It's arbitraging. And I think that's what economists, that's the Kool-Aid we drank as kids studying economics. And I think that's still true for a lot of products. And so, for those cases, what I'm saying is that what I'm proposing is probably a intermediate situation. I would expect existing sellers to increase their prices, but not exorbitantly, but that would be sufficient to create some incentive for additional supply. And again, this is another example to go back to what Charles mentioned earlier. It's very important to understand what the supply elasticity is. That depends on how big the problem is. Is this a problem for the entire country or only for a part of the country? For the entire world or just part of the world? Life is complicated. So I don't have a general answer to that, just a general suggestion for how policy could go about these sort of issues.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Luis. So that was super nice. And so I hope to see everybody again next week. We will have Tito Boeri and we'll keep going on until mid-July. Thanks, Luis, and thanks to everybody. Bye-bye.